Number 1, post. Forward, march. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 185th anniversary of Dade's Battle. I ask at this time if you'll please stand, say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated. We stand here today on the 185th anniversary of the battle that effectively started the longest and most costly of all Native removal wars. What was then called the Florida War, today we call the Second Seminole War. Before we start, I would like to introduce a few people that are instrumental in both keeping this park going and keeping the memory of the soldiers and Seminoles of these wars. Starting in the rear there, Mr. Bill Gruber, if you'll raise your hand. Bill is the park manager here for Dade Battlefield. I continue to embarrass him year after year by stating what an incredible job that he does here at the park in not only honoring history, but maintaining the nature and being a good conservator of the state's land. It's very rare in state parks where you get both a historian and a conservationist. You generally get one or the other, sometimes one, but here we are blessed to have both. Myself, I'll introduce, I am Ross Lamoureux. I am normally the commander of troops at the battle reenactment. Also blessed this year to be the president of the Dade Battlefield Society. We have a couple other members with us today. I'd like to recognize Matt Griffin back there is one of our Seminoles. He is the secretary of the organization. My lovely wife, Amber Lamoureux, is everything else, basically. Treasurer, social media director, and keeper of myself. But I'd also like to introduce Mr. Steve Rink right over here, president of the Seminole Wars Foundation, a group that does an absolute incredible job in maintaining the memories of the soldiers and Seminoles this period. He would like to come up and say a few words.
Thank you, Ross, and good afternoon, everybody. The Seminole War Foundation was founded in 1992 by 4 individuals, the most prominent one of whom was Frank Laumer. Frank Laumer was my very good friend, and we lost Frank about 390 days ago, just prior to the last wreath ceremony that we had in 2019. But I wanted to mention, Ross mentioned about the anniversary of the battle. It's very true. 185 years ago at this moment, there were between 30 and 40 individuals within these breastworks area, and possibly 60 or more of their number around and scattered who had already fallen, most of whom had since passed. But 40 years ago at this moment, my good friend Frank Laumer was right here in the same spot that we are today, initiating the very first representation of the Dade's Battle reenactment back in 1980 on this date. And about that same time, he also initiated the very first wreath ceremony. Very important to him and all of us that we remember what happened here on this hallowed ground on that date, December 28 in 1835. I wanted to mention also one other kind of curious thing. The most prominent survivor of the battle, Private Ransom Clark from New York, has been researched ad infinitum by Mr. Laumer and others over the years, to the point where Frank almost felt as if that he was the rekindled spirit of Ransom Clark. We just found out, just by coincidence, about 3 weeks ago, on November 18th, 1840, Ransom Clark died. We knew that. But we also remarked that on November 18th, 2019, Frank Laumer died. The very same day, month and day, many years separated, those two souls, hopefully they have met each other since and are looking down upon us today. So I wanted you to remember all of those individuals, both soldier and Seminole, who gave their lives here that day in 1835, and also to remember all those who came afterwards who now work to remember those and keep their memory alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. As a reenactor, living historian, and part of the festivities here at the park for coming on 20 years, very early on I felt that this ceremony, this service on the actual anniversary day of the battle is more important than even the reenactment that we do. It's the reenactment that generally draws thousands of people and the community rallies behind and people know and recognize. And without the reenactment, the majority of people would not have heard about Major Dade, his men, and the Seminoles that fought here. And it is, of course, the premier living history event I know of, at least in the state, if not the country. So without that reenactment, we probably wouldn't be here. But the actual anniversary day that Frank Laumer started, created this, and was carried on for years by Mr. Jerry Morris, and more recently by myself, we feel that this is the important day to remember. So for you folks that came today, you are an important part in keeping the history alive, keeping the memories of those men alive, and gives me good hope year after year that there are still some folks. Because for anybody that's a product of the public school system here in Florida, you're going to recognize that if anything at all is said about the Seminole Wars, it's on 1 or 2 pages of a book in about a half an hour of classroom time. And for the years that these wars existed, 1 or 2 pages just doesn't do it. We talk long and hard about the other wars from the American Revolution right up to today, and they all have a very important role in what we do and how we are and why we're here. But the Seminole Wars are our history. It happened right here, not just in our area or our backyard, but we are sitting and standing today on where history happened. And it's very, very important to me that we recognize that. Also, in conjunction with this ceremony that we do on the anniversary date, in years past, on the Saturday of the reenactment, we read the names of all the men who fell from the Army side. Being that this year, with the craziness of this year, and we're not having the reenactment event that we normally would have next week, we are going to include that in the service today. So I hope that you'll bear with me as we read those names, because it's very important that this wasn't just a group of men. These were men, individuals, with lives and families. And so we're going to recognize that today. Before that, for those of you that just by your virtue of being here today, have shown an interest in history. If you are not already, I encourage you to become members of both the Dade Battlefield Society, which is the citizen support organization that helps this park run, but also the Seminole Wars Foundation, which is a learning and academic society of both regular folks and academics, but anybody is qualified to join. These two organizations help keep this going and alive, and your membership and your efforts with those organizations will go a great way to continue history going alive. So after the ceremony, for anybody interested in those, you can find me for the Dade Battlefield Society, and Mr. Rink here, I'm sure, will be happy to talk to you about the Seminole Wars Foundation. But Frank Laumer, the gentleman he talked about, was instrumental in both of those. And it was Frank's efforts those years ago that sparked the interest. And for now 40 years, we have had the honor to honor those men. So, as Steve said, this time, 185 years ago, this battle was being fought, and we're in the epicenter of that battlefield. Where this reproduction breastworks lies today is the spot where the remaining men of Dade's column fell and were buried. Several weeks after the battle, in a service and ceremony led by the 4th U.S. Infantry, led by Colonel Foster, who came and found the remains those weeks later, buried them, and they laid here until 1842 at the end of the Second Seminole War, where they were then removed and reinterred in what became the National Cemetery in St. Augustine, Florida. You can go today to that cemetery at St. Francis Barracks, the headquarters of the Florida National Guard, and under the pyramids lie Dade's men, Major Dade and 6 other officers. But that day, 108 men woke up that morning a few miles away in their camp at the Round Clay Sink just south of town, basically a sinkhole with a little open area to camp. It had been raining profusely a couple days leading up. The temperatures were in the low 40s. Kind of similar to a couple days ago. If anybody was outside working around their houses without the rain, we had that temperature. And it reminded me a couple days ago as I was kind of shivering outside, saying, well, at least I get to go inside and make breakfast. Dade's men in a couple days wouldn't have had that opportunity. But it was that weather that was instrumental in how the battle first unfolded. Because as those men got up that morning with the rain and cold, they got out of their blankets, rolled them back, put them in their knapsack, possibly boiled some water for coffee, ate any remaining rations that they had starting from their march just a few days prior from downtown, what is now downtown Tampa, the site of Fort Brooke, an Army installation. They woke up that morning, got packed up, ready to move north to continue on to Fort King, their mission. Fort King was the larger Army installation just north of here in what became Ocala. Dade's mission was to bring 3 companies of men to bolster the garrison at Fort King because of the tensions. It wasn't a matter of if there was going to be a war, it was when. There had been several small incursions, several firings and short skirmishes prior, so it was inevitable. But it was with that knowledge that Major Dade led 3 companies of men. 2 companies of the 2nd and 3rd U.S. Artillery, a small unit of the 4th U.S. Infantry, and several other artillerymen to fill in the artillery companies to come up with those 100+ men. So that was the ultimate mission, was to leave Fort Brooke in relative comfort, travel through Christmas Day, and arrive at Fort King. As history tells us, they were stopped prior to making it to Fort King on this very grounds. Major Dade wasn't even supposed to be the commander of this. In fact, that honor was to initially lie on Captain George Washington Gardner of the U.S. Artillery. But Captain Gardner's wife was ill, and Major Dade volunteered to lead in Captain Gardner's place. Captain Gardner, after the men left on the march, was able to get his wife on a ship to go to Key West and eventually to New Orleans, and she survived. And he caught up with the men after a day's march. But being a gentleman, didn't relinquish command. Major Dade kept command. He didn't try to take it again. But it was Dade's respect for Captain Gardner and his wife that even put him on the mission. As the senior officer, he had the choice to stay at Fort Brooke. But as he led these men up the Fort King Road, which is just behind us along that trail, if you have not been on the battlefield, I encourage you afterwards to follow the markers and see where this action occurred. The men were spread out basically from the back gate almost to the front gate. These 100 men were tired, they were cold, and because they had just traveled over several rivers and extreme water crossings, they saw light at the end of the tunnel and thought they were just about to Fort King, and, well, their guard was kind of down. Many of the men had their overcoats buckled over their accoutrements because they're carried rolled up on their knapsacks, and it was easier to just put those on. That would lead to catastrophe on the opening volleys. But the very first shot fired in this battle by the Seminoles was aimed for and hit Major Dade and killed him, knocking him off his horse. The remaining volley from that initial round took down almost half of the Army command. Only due to the professionalism and dedication of the remaining officers and non-commissioned officers of these companies were the men able to continue on. And not just continue on, but for over 3 hours, down to the last round. It is remarked after the battle by those Seminoles that were interviewed years later that upon investigating after the battle and checking the bodies, to a man, those cartridge boxes were empty. The limber, the box carrying the artillery rounds with the cannon that came along, was empty. Canteens were empty. Despite losing half of their command in the first few seconds, they fought for 3 more hours. It was some called divine providence that led to the conclusion of the battle, because very early on the Seminoles made their point. Their whole point was to attack, to show we do not want to leave, we are going to defend our homes. It was a bold statement, but they were going to leave the remaining ones back, let them go back and tell the story. But as was part of Army doctrine, they began to create a defensive works, a barricade of long pine trees that they would cut down, replicated here, to create a defensive position for mostly to keep the men safe, those of the wounded. The artillery continued to fire, and one by one, the men would be placed in the barricade. A bayonet charge was led by officers, and it was that charge that should have ended the battle. The Seminoles fled to the rear and met up, but then they began to hear the sounds of the axes and saws from the pioneers, the engineers of the unit. And they realized that the gods were smiling. They were pinning the men up for them to finish them off. And it was that barricade that ultimately led to the Seminoles coming back, attacking, and finishing it off. Of those 108 men of the U.S. Army, there were 3 survivors. One of those survivors, Ransom Clark, made it back to Fort Brooke in Tampa over several days, wounded 5 times, hit 5 times with an Indian rifle. He was able to tell the story and report back on what happened. In the days before radio, TV, and the internet could give you the news almost before it happens. It took several days for the Army to find out, and then several weeks for the Army to come upon the scene. And Colonel Foster found those men here where they fell. He initially buried the officers in one grave and the enlisted in the barricade right where they're at. Those spots are marked here on the battlefield for you to walk and see. Further on up the column, Major Dade's spot, all the way down from Captain Gardner, the remaining captains and lieutenants. Those obelisks mark where they fell. Here we are 185 years later, and I was thinking this morning as I got up how close to the bicentennial we are. We're only 15 years away from that. I was a little kid, all but 7 years old, when we had the bicentennial of the American Revolution. And that was celebrated all around the country, parades, movies, documentaries, a surge in living history and reenacting programs. And I thought this morning how wonderful that would be to have a surge in our own American history, but about the Seminole Wars. You know, we have events, we have historic sites, and we're blessed to have a wonderful both state and county parks and other private historic sites that remember and commemorate every day. But wouldn't it be wonderful that if the rest of the country, heck, just our own neighbors, could remember what happened here? Because at that time, this was groundbreaking national news. It was in every national newspaper around the country. Major Dade dead. Massacre, it was called. That led to the entire regular armed forces at the time. Army, Navy, and Marine Corps coming down to Florida and fighting. Volunteer troops from many different states. And as I said earlier, today it's just a very minor footnote, if at all, in any of the textbooks. So today I thank you for taking time out of the holiday season on an absolutely gorgeous day to remember them. And let's keep in mind as we progress towards that bicentennial, some of us aren't getting any younger, but I think most of us have a chance to be around then. But wouldn't it be wonderful to have that same stir for 190-year anniversary, 195, but at least the bicentennial? Let's keep that in mind as we go forward in history. As I said, normally we read the names of the men at a very special service that we hold on Saturday night every year at the reenactment. It is one of the most magical services that I've had the honor to be a part. We do it at night with candles. We arrange the candles in the barricade in rows, and as each name is read, a candle is extinguished, much as the life of each man was extinguished here that day. We're in broad daylight, so we lose a little bit of the dramatic effect, but the reality is, as I read each name, remember that these were the lives of individuals who, many of them were not born Americans. Many soldiers at that time were immigrants from Ireland, England, Germany. It was a very cosmopolitan group of men who fell that day. And this ceremony started initially to honor the soldier dead. But the last few years, we've come to realize that they weren't the only ones who fell today. There were natives from, today we call them Seminoles, but culturally they were from several different tribes. There were folks who were part of the Creek culture, Muskogee, Miccosukee. There were black Seminoles. There were white Seminoles. So Seminole is more an ideology than it is a blood grouping. But all that aside, there were several of them who fell too. And even though they came out the victor that day, they spent the remaining 6+ years scraping by, fighting several smaller conflicts all throughout Central Florida and eventually down into the Everglades. By the end of the Third Seminole War in the late 1850s, there were less than 200 Seminoles remaining in all of Florida. Those 200 started out as over 5,000 in the late 1820s and early 1830s. So although we can say perhaps that the Seminoles were the victor on that day, and that there was no formal winner or loser declared, no formal treaty signed at the end, in the end, everybody was a loser in this. So today, as I read those names, let's also remember those natives who fought for their homes. From Francis L. Dade, detached from Company B, 4th U.S. Infantry, Sergeant Peter Thomas, Private John Barnes, Private Daniel Campbell, Private Enoch Cates, Private Martin Cunningham, Private Cornelius Donovan, Private John Doty, Private William Downs, Private Samuel Hall, Private Willie Jones, and Private John Markham. From the 2nd U.S. Artillery Regiment, Captain George Washington Gardner, First Lieutenant William Elon Bassinger, Second Lieutenant Richard Henderson. From Company B of the 2nd U.S. Artillery, Private Edward Boston, Private Ransom Clark, Private Edwin DeCourcy, Private Michael Kinney, Private Anthony Laughlin, Private John McCartney, Private James McDonald, Private John McWiggin, Private Hugh Peary, Private Patrick Roney, Private John Thomas. Detached from Company H, 2nd U.S. Artillery, Private Richard Bowen, Private Henry Brondon, Private John Craig, Private John Cairns, Private Hugh McMee, Private John Patton, Private Reuben Phillips, Private John Stafford, Private Hiram Taylor, Private Thomas Thornton, Private William Wright. From Company C, 2nd U.S. Artillery, First Sergeant John Hood, Sergeant Philip Cooper, Sergeant John Lovis, Sergeant Thomas Savin, Corporal Nicholas Clark, Corporal James Dunlap, Corporal Michael Ryan, Corporal Rufus Barton, Private William Black, Private Richard Bork, Private Owen Bovin, Private William Carney, Private Thomas Davis, Private Alpheus Gillette, Private Isaac Grant, Private Robert Green, Private John Halter, Private Charles Heck, Private Cornelius Hill, Private William Holmes, Private George Howard, Private John Hurley, Private Aaron Jewell, Private Thomas Narr, Private Robert Mulvahall, Private William Neely, Private Patrick Rafferty, Private John Riley, Private William Robertson, Private Casper Schneider, Private Isaac Taylor, Private William Taylor, Private Joseph Wilson, and Private Orville Worcester. From the 3rd U.S. Artillery Regiment, Captain Upton Frazier, Second Lieutenant Robert Mudge, Brevet Second Lieutenant John Keyes. From Company B of the 3rd U.S. Artillery, Sergeant Benjamin Chapman, Sergeant Austin Farley, Sergeant John Veiling, Corporal Alexander Jones, Corporal Philander Wells, Corporal George Young, Private George Bertram, Private Patrick Kamaski, Private Ben Carpenter, Private Samuel Dodge, Private William Flanagan, Private John Folk, Private Jordan Hall, Private George Hurley, Private Samuel Kinkerly, Private Jacob Neeland, Private Samuel Lemon, Private William Minton, Private John Mulcahy, Private Donald Monroe, Private William Randall, Private John Schaefer, Private Henry Senram, Private Joseph Sprague, Private Washington Tuck, Private Richard Vreeland, Private Henry Wagner, Private Daniel Wetchsung, Private Sylvester Welsh, Private John Williams, Private Samuel Wright, and Private George York. Also was Assistant Surgeon John Gatlin, a civilian, an enslaved man by the name of Louis Pacheco, who was the guide and interpreter of the column, and 3 unknown soldiers. As we read those names and realize that over 100 men died here and later, also those Seminoles in on the attack, they're believed to be 4 or more that were killed here on site, many others in the years remaining in the conflict. Let's pause and remember them, at least today, if not the rest of the days and months and years ahead. This is, as I said, our history. Not just our country or our backyard, but right here. At this time, I'd like everyone to rise as we present a wreath to honor those men. Detail. May be seated. We started this ceremony years ago to remember the soldiers, but as we are historians also, remember that there are 2 sides to every story. And through the years of living history and academic education, we realize the powerful story of the natives that were here, the Seminoles. So we honored them too. And at this time, I would like to call forward our Seminole brothers to recognize them who continue the history, and also honor those who were here before originally. If you'll step forward. Mr. Steve Creamer, my good friend and colleague, both on the Battlefield Society and on the actual battlefield of reenacting, would like to say some words.
Ishte, Eskungo, Tawatuskanoogie, Miko Seminole. Good afternoon, how are you? My name is Gunpowder Warrior, head warrior of the Seminole Nation, Seminole tribes. On this ground behind me and all the way almost to the entrance of the park, you're on the battlefield. All this ground behind you is battlefield. Ross said this is our history, the history of this community and this place. To a lot of us, it's our personal history, our family history. Most of us have a personal connection to this battlefield. Myself, it's part of my heritage. And I'm sure Ross feels the same way, as do all the men here. My brother here, Matt Griffin, is Black Seminole. Matt started here when he was about 10 years old and learned his heritage and has continued to pass it on to the generations yet to come and those that have passed. The other man you see there portrays Pochinko. He is the black slave who's the interpreter for the military. All of us are here for a love of the history and to keep it alive. You would be well to look into the history of the park and the event. This is where all of it started, the Seminole Indian Wars. If you go over to Fort King, if you go down to the Big Cypress Shootout, or most of the Seminole Indian events in this state, you'll see that most of them started right here and broke off and became what today is more history within the state and the state park system. If you're interested in the history, I encourage all of you to speak with our manager, Bill Groover, or Steve Rink, or Ross, who's the president of the society, and learn. We can always use more help, and there's all kinds of opportunity here. Dale, it's nice to see you sitting there. I remember many a time you stood right here. We thank you for coming. The Seminole Tribe of Florida, when we have the reenactment, have people come up. Pedro Cepeda tells the Seminole side of the story. Moses Jumper, who's a chief justice for the tribe, comes up and participates. You'd be surprised how much support we receive from those people and how much we give in return. This is extended family. We all stay in touch with each other. We all know when something's going on. And I don't mean just at the park or with the Seminole. I mean with each other. So if you love doing family things, especially with your children, your grandchildren, this is a good place to come and do it. You'll be surprised what they learned. You'll be surprised at the way you're treated when you come in. If you grew up in the neighborhood like I did, where it was yes sir and no sir and yes ma'am and no ma'am, that's what you're going to get here. It's all about respect for each other. Remember, these men on both sides fought for one thing: their freedom, protecting their way of life. Our people did not enter into this lightly. When we have the reenactment, the battle out here, we always ask for the Creator's blessing before we ever go on the field, realizing what this was going to do to our people, the deprivation and the sacrifice that would be made. There's a lot that happens that you'll never read in a history book. You need to come out and learn history from the other side of the coin sometimes. Ross, we'll turn it back over to you. Thank you very much.
This is the part of the program where we symbolically shake hands, but due to this crazy world, maintaining our distance.
There's our 6 foot.
Well, the symbolic right there.
Thank you,
Steve is
brother.
as much my brother in real life as he is out here on the field, and I thank him and everyone else that's here today. In conclusion, again, I thank each and every one of you for coming out today. It's a very special day for us as living historians, for the park, for recognition about why the whole reason the park was created in the first place. And you guys could have been doing anything else but come out here in the holiday season and a gorgeous day, but you chose to come out here, and we thank you. Without further ado and no more formalities, we conclude this ceremony with my eternal thanks. Have a great day.